Okay, today I'm going to start off just saying I'm up to episode 3 of Star Wars' Andor, and it is so damn good. Now, I'm not really much of a Star Wars fan. As a kiddo, I loved the original trilogy, but I never caught up in the franchise corporate fiction. Yes, that includes the much beloved Mandalorian. Don't get me wrong, I loved it, but not nearly as much as the hype that surrounded it. I never felt a deep connection to Star Wars. I still think that lightsabers are awesome, and I would have loved to have been a Jedi. But really, the costuming is the main reason I watched. Star Wars has always set the bar for costume design. But outside that, I only watch Star Wars to pass an hour or two on a slow rainy day. Andor is different from the other Star Wars stories, at least up to what I've seen. Later episodes might change, but just have to wait and see. But as it is, it feels less a story of heroes and more a story of existence, survival, and the grey within the world. More than that, Andor isn't aimed at its original audience. At least, it doesn't seem to be. Gone is a childish, friendly story, and in its stead is a more steady and adult one. And the best thing about it is that it doesn't detract from original fans. It is made in such a way that if a big Star Wars fan isn't into that style, they won't feel betrayed by it. It doesn't harm the original narrative in any way. It is a story, successfully told in the same universe, without harming it in any way. I wish I could say the same for the Rings of Power. Because though Andor is aimed at an alternate audience, or seem to be trying to capture those who don't care for Star Wars, aka people like me, Rings of Power on the other hand has zero respect for the original fans, and doesn't seem to be aimed at some other group of people to bring into the fold. Who exactly is Rings of Power's intended audience? Because I can say, as a female-born woke individual, I loathe 90% of it. And that's the crux of it. Andor feels like it was made by people who love what they're creating and made a story that fits nicely into the universe. Rings of Power feels more like fan fiction, but without the fans behind it. The story only barely touches on the events in Tolkien lore, and there is a lot of subverting and moving it around. I suspect some of it is false to misdirect the viewer, but there is plenty changed on a massive scale that would upset even fans who've only consumed the movies. The only thing that feels potentially right are the scenes and set designs. A love of Tolkien's work plus respect for the lore plus a clear audience would have been a better guideline. I'm sure they would have made it work. But instead we get this weirdly poorly thought through mesh that seems to only hit right with a very small group of people. This direction is strange, because even though what we get isn't even actually fan fiction but corporate fiction, one would expect that those behind it would aim at a clear audience so they could successfully market off it. But we don't even get that. To be honest, I don't know what Amazon was thinking. How can someone drop $60 million on an episode and not have a clear ambition to create the best thing they possibly can? I can't fathom it. I can't understand why they've approached it like this. It feels like self-sabotage, but with everything riding on his show, that is a very strange way to shoot yourself in the foot. Andor, on the other hand, feels loved in every respect. Even as a natural-born nitpicker, I found very little of my logical brain to latch onto. The story is actually very simple. Well, it is right now, but it's so beautifully executed. The cinematography is beautiful, the sets and costumes are amazing, but one would expect that from Star Wars. With the exception of Power Ranger bikies, that is. And the tension in the show is just perfect. Compare that to Rings of Power. Well, I can give an example of that. In Andor, episode 3, warning, spoilers ahead, we are graced with a scene where the blue-suited police force, or whatever they are called, have landed on the planet and are hunting down our protagonist. We get a series of scenes of them walking the streets. One local starts banging a repetitive beat on some rubbish hanging from a building. This in turn sets off a cascade as locals rush about, many joining the beat. Soon the whole city is ringing with a tinny sound. You can see the uncertainty in the blue suits as they march through. The other scene is with Cassian Andor and his new mysterious visitor. They are surrounded and have to fight their way out. Chaos ensues. The blue suits try to get to Cassian. Cassian is trying to escape. The tinny sound of metal ringing from everywhere. Elsewhere, a couple of blue suits are guarding Cassian's elderly, motherly character lady. She explains the banging noise, slowly getting to her point. It's not the banging that you have to worry about. It's when it stops that you need to worry. You see the fear rise in one of the police-like forcemen's face. Then the banging stops. I was on the edge of my seat this whole scene. It was so well done. The tension that it built You could feel how terrifying it would have been to be a small armed unit in a city that does not want you there. Now to the Rings of Power. Well, there really isn't anything to compare. We're 5 episodes into the show and we've barely got anything to show for it. The few short action scenes we get have almost no tension within them. The closest we probably get is, I think, in episode 3, where Arondir the elf is captured by orcs. With a sack of humans and a couple of his elven brethren, he is chained and forced to dig a trench. The whole trench scene is terrible in itself, but ignoring the terrible plot writing, there is a scene where they try to escape by breaking the chains with work tools. They have a small advantage in that they are in the daylight, and they join together to pull back on the chains and keep themselves in the light. Covered orcs occasionally brave the light to attack them. There is so much wrong with the whole orcs daylight approach, but again, we're not focused on the bad writing, but the scene itself. When the orcs fail, they release a warg. For those who don't know, it's supposed to be a wolf-like character. But what we get instead is something that suspiciously looks like Ed from the Lion King animation. We get a brutal fight scene, and with it is unnecessary show of violence reminiscent of Game of Thrones. But our hero is too good for the warg and manages to trap it. And only one elf manages to escape, and Andor climbs up to watch him die just before he himself is overwhelmed by orcs again, and thus the tension ends, except there was very little tension in the whole scene. The most tension we experience is when they are hitting the chains, trying to get them to break. But that was less tension and more frustration. There is no feeling of plight of the enslaved. There is no horror at the deaths along the way. There was no relief from the one escape or bugger me when he also died. It just felt like filler while we waited for the episode to end. And after the whole attempt, we discover in the next episode that the character is released anyway, making the whole attempt pointless. There's also a scene in episode 5 where we are graced with elven superior swordsmanship in the form of Galadriel sparring with some human recruits. Again, there is no tension. The whole scene felt like they would burst out into song at any minute. It ironically felt more like a Disney scene. It would have been fantastic in a Gilbert and Sullivan production. It was fun, that's true, but it also felt out of place. It was just a no-stakes fight where we know the main character is in no danger of losing. We know elves are supposed to be extraordinary fighters, and even if we lean into the Galadriel warrior princess trope, we could have made it interesting. She could have still had the upper hand, but with 5 or 6 competent human soldiers, she could have also been given a run for her money. Instead, we get Cena-style corniness. Cena-style corniness is great, I'm all for it, but it does not fit when your show is supposed to be serious. It detracts from Galadriel's character and turns into nothing more than an angry-filled Mary Sue, which is infinitely worse than a rationally well-mannered Mary Sue, aka Captain America. And that is another point against Rings of Power. The main characters are too strong and too perfect. There is nothing left to chance. There is no errors or mistakes. There is no luck and there is no challenge. Compare that to Andor. Again, spoilers ahead. Where in the first episode we have Cassian approached by 2 blue suits. And by pure bad luck, he struck out in defense and one of the blue suits falls back and hits his head and dies. A situation that could befall any of us. What should have been a mostly harmless scrap turned fatal. Now Cassian is faced with the second blue suit and a choice. Let the guy live and hope he doesn't come after him, or kill him and leg it. Cassian does the latter. In the moment, he decides that the remaining blue suit can't be trusted and kills him. He reacts on survival, and despite learning that he's a fundamentally decent human being, he chooses self-preservation. He is flawed, he is human, he is relatable. Galadriel is not relatable. And now lastly we come to how everything looks. We all know that Rings of Power looks beautiful. That is absolutely true. The effects in Rings of Power wins hands down. But visuals are more than sets and CGI. One of the most important aspects of visual media is cinematography and scene setup. A good cinematographer can wow you. The thing with Rings of Power is that the camera work feels flat. There are a few examples of good framing and setup, but the vast majority of the filming is static and lifeless. It feels like they put way too much reliance on CGI and not enough on how camera work can influence the feel. A good example is the scene when Theo is trying to escape the orcs in his abandoned village. We have this attempt at a continuous shot in movement, which isn't too bad. But what became painfully obvious was that when he wasn't in danger of being caught, the camera stayed with him centre of frame. But there are a few scenes where we near a corner or something and instantly the framing changes 2/3 and suddenly all tension is lost because we know something is going to jump out. And true to the word, that's exactly what happens. Risk and reward is taken away from the viewer as we are told in advance what to expect. I can't really describe how Andor gets it right. They seem to have several different scenes, some where the camera is lower, some where it's higher, some where lighting complements the scenes beautifully. In the last scene of episode 3, we see a parallel dual scene of young Cassian and adult Cassian leaving planet in a ship. The shot switching between the two different events in his life. But not only are we using Cassian's age to mark the switches, we're also seeing things from two different ships and two different pilots. But there is another trick used, one which makes it unmistakable which scene we're in. There is a deliberate difference in colour palette lighting, and it is so well done. We watch as the scenes mirror each other and bring such a satisfying conclusion to the end of the episode. And it wasn't a cheap final scene hook used in almost every episode of Rings of Power. It was just a beautifully crafted bit of art that draws you in and leaves you thinking, wow. I really hope Andor keeps the quality up. What I've seen so far is borderline masterpiece, and I can't wait to watch more. Whereas I keep watching Rings of Power, not because I like it, mostly I dislike it, but because Amazon is resorting to cheap clickbait tricks to keep you in. Which one is Sauron? Who is the stranger? Who will Halbrand become? I keep watching, but it is not satisfying in the least, and the only way I'd rewatch Season 1 is if they pulled themselves together in Season 2 and actually bring the level of love that Andor clearly has.